Ms. Corien Vermaak to make her presentation. The presentation will be on board's role in overseeing cybersecurity risk management and implementation. Over to you, Corien.
And thank you very much for the invitation again to speak to everybody today. It really has been a privilege for me to be part of these interactions. I'm going to, let me quickly see, there you go. Let's quickly share my screen. Do we have visibility on the screen at the moment, and is my audio okay?
Yes, perfect.
Perfect. So let's jump into it. So the topic for discussion for my part of the seminar today is risk management for cybersecurity, very specifically. And if we unpack that as a topic a little bit broader, we look at specifically the board's role in overseeing the cybersecurity risk management and implementation. And we really have to look at it in effectively three parts. How do we get to understanding our risks? How do we do that risk analysis part? What kind of help do we need? And then obviously as the latter part, what are some of the things that we need to be aware of as a board to understand some of the implementation constraints that we have? So briefly, I've been introduced, but my name is Corien Vermaak. I am an ISO 27001 lead auditor, but within my role within CISCO, I'm a cybersecurity specialist. And again, very, very humble and happy to be here and talking to everybody today. So I have to take a pause moment and talk about the term accountability. As an executive, non-executive board member, as somebody at the steering helm of an organization, we are accountable by obligation. So it's rather important when we look at the definition that we are accountable by obligation to take responsibility for what happens in the organization. Now, this is very unique because there are many people responsible, jointly responsible for how we treat risks and how we manage and implement risk controls within our organization. Yet the buck ultimately stops with us. As the board members, we hold the highest count of accountability. If we look at what has recently been in the news, there's an globally an absolute trend towards keeping board members responsible for these cyber threats, for digital transformation, for looking at how hacks happened and what was done to prevent it or to understand the risk. And I think the Maersk case study is quite tremendous, and how everybody unpacked it, left me with quite a few notes that I'll address during the run of my session. But globally, we have to acknowledge that the legislators in all of the different countries are in each framework making a closer step to making the board and making the leadership of an organization more and more accountable for what happens when they are under a cyber attack, what happens when they are faced with a data breach, what happens when there are financial losses to the shareholders due to cyber breaches. And this is just going to increase. We have recently in Australia also seen new frameworks see the light, come off the tables of the legislators. And those new frameworks put even an increased accountability on the board to take the responsibility for cyber risk. And when the case study was unpacked a little bit earlier, somebody said that maybe the goaling or maybe the incentive packages weren't aligned to really take this kind of security risk seriously. Now, we can take a carrot or a stick approach. We can incentivize you to secure, or we can send you to jail. In certain countries, the legislation has developed to a field where if you are found grossly negligent in the field of protecting your organization against cyber risks that you were made aware of, making the correct allowance in terms of budget to correct these cyber risks that you were made aware of, that you can be found guilty for being negligent in your role as a board member. And these kind of notions that we're seeing across the globe really should, awaken us all to the reality that we not only have an oversight role within looking at risk, but we absolutely have a role in overseeing that implementation happens effectively. The responsibility with power is the basics of that statement. Global legislators recognize the importance of this accountability towards cybersecurity now. That responsibility needs to be unpacked, looking at what are our other roles within a board. We have a role towards the strategy of the organization. We have a role towards ensuring this gets executed. And then obviously we also have a role towards profitability, as we ultimately are the spokespeople for the shareholders of the organization. And it really becomes quite critical if you look at cybersecurity, how it touches all of those elements. It can certainly play a big role when it comes to the profitability of an organization. If there has to be a massive resilient response, new equipment needs to be bought to be able to make an organization, recover from a cyber breach. And that really weighs heavily on the other two components, being strategy and execution. I want to unpack that a little bit more in detail, because again, when the case study was unpacked, there was a big emphasis put on governance, risk, and compliance, which is something that we deal with on a day-to-day basis as part of our obligations and, serving our organization in that field. But we really have to look at our role in ensuring impact, oversight, and succession. And how do we do that? We look at the strategy of the organization. And you would have heard out of the case study video that after the cyber breach, there was a strategy to become cyber resilient to the degree that it is a competitive advantage. So it's very interesting how boards are not only looking at the implementation part of cybersecurity, but they're looking at becoming so compliant that that becomes an asset in itself. When we look at the execution, we are ultimately responsible to oversee the operational day-to-day management of the organization. There are people goaled and incentivized to run the organization on a daily basis. And these people are sometimes burdened with some of these risks, these governance, compliance. It is our obligation to ask the tough questions when they are brought in front of the board to say, where are we on the project with regards to cyber resilient? Because ultimately we are accountable for those controls. We are very, very responsible for succession and planning. And succession not only talks about the succession of the board, the succession of leadership, but it also talks about the succession of the organization. We have all been dealt a vast amount of difficult cards to play over the last 12 months with the different way of engaging with our other board members, running our organizations in a virtual manner. All of this could not be done if there wasn't some form of a succession planning, some form of resilience planning in that orchestrates that sustainability of the organization. And I think that really puts it so eloquently. It really orchestrates the sustainability of the organization, because it's so critical to understand. Nowhere in this does it touch the relevance to cybersecurity. But we can already start by what we're hearing, reading, and seeing, tying the notions to how important cybersecurity plays the roles and risk management plays the roles within these core obligations of the board, orchestrating the sustainability that resilience, that ability towards what the case study said, to recover thousands of devices, to re-image thousands of devices all over the world. That sustainability is what ultimately is entrenched in what we're trying to do from a risk mitigation point of view. Review mergers and acquisitions. This may seem like a task not relevant to cybersecurity. As an ISO auditor in my previous life, it is probably one of the biggest tasks that I had. The most amount of questions coming around my desk is, we are in due diligence phase, we are looking at a merger, but the following contracts have been flagged to lack controls with regard to cybersecurity. Managed service providers, ISPs, nowhere within the contract, because that immediately puts an obligation on the organization to now deal with this service provider in a different manner. So when we look at discharging our obligations as board members, they are very much aligned with what we need and are obligated to do from a cybersecurity point of view. The last block that we look at from a board role is that transition. Coaching and mentoring CEOs and overseeing the evolution of the organization and the board. It's really important in that, and if you were present at my previous seminar, I talked about that culture of resilience. It really is important that as a board, we start with that culture of resilience. If cybersecurity is every board meeting, the last topic on the agenda, and the risk officer does not get his chance to present, you know, what is the message that we feed back into the leadership of the organization? Nah, I didn't get to present again this week, or the board didn't ask me many questions because we were at the end of the agenda again. It's really important in that transition that we also plant that seed within our organization to stress the importance of cybersecurity. If it's a priority for us, it will be a priority for them. We can no longer put on our mask of anonymous. We cannot play the card that smile for the boardroom photo, but I am not part to what has happened from a cybersecurity perspective. Each board member within their unique role take up an obligation to secure the organization and ensure its profitability. As part of that, it's very important to acknowledge that role that we play from a cyber resilience, cybersecurity, and risk management point of view. When we look at how some of our other roles are defined, they sprout out of legislation, out of regulations, and out of long-standing standards within the business community. So are some of the other obligations within or relating to cybersecurity. Again, the governance, risk, and compliance comment came up, really tying back to how does the organization comply? Do we have the intent? Do we have the strategic intent to only comply with the bare minimum so that we can get the auditor off our back? Or do we set a strategic intent to be that differentiator? To be the organization that says we can guarantee that we are resilient from a technology perspective, that we can recover when we see major cyber threats. And again, there was a comment made, and I really enjoyed how Prof talked about the maturity model. It's right up my alley, these kind of maturity models. I always enjoy that. It's critical to understand in that. The comment around, but they didn't do their patches. Surely they cannot be in the progressive state. Surely they should be in the immature state when they cannot even have the processes and policies in place to have good discipline and hygiene around patch management. And I absolutely agree with that statement. But for each organization, that need for compliance is different. Why? Because the strategic intent is different. How we see it and how we message it is so very important to our organization. But let's have a look at today's topic in a little bit more detail. Risk management refers to the practice of identifying potential risk in advance, analyzing them, and taking precautionary steps to reduce or curb the risk. So if we take this in summary, we talk about the identification of risk. And that is such a big and vast topic that I always am troubled if anybody says, oh, there's only one way to do it. I truly am of belief that the identification of risk is part and parcel unique to every business. And we're going to unpack that a little bit later on. Then we have to analyze these risks. What are these risks? Where are they in terms of probability? Because that's really important. And then the ultimate is that we need to take the precaution. We need to protect our organization in a practical and tangible way to ensure that those risks do not wipe us out. When you read financial books and financial planning books, the general message around it is that ensure that you have a backup plan for something that can financially ruin you. If a flood hits your house, that can financially ruin you. So you should have insurance against that. If something catastrophic were to happen to your primary means of transport, that could financially ruin you. You should have insurance or a mitigation or a backup plan for that specific risk. And that is setting it in probably the most understandable and simplistic way. But it's no vastly different to how we should apply it in the business realm. When we look at it from a business perspective, it's critical to ultimately look at that step of taking precaution. Let's have a look at how this plays out in terms of risk identification. So identification of risk and their clauses. Now, this is really important as we later on go into the seminar into a little bit more detail, because this is different for people. Somebody might see phishing as a massive risk because they have the information at hand to understand how many people in the organization is affected by phishing on a daily basis. But to the next person that doesn't have the same information at hand, phishing might not be of any concern. They are of opinion that surely you can identify a phishing email. And surely that should not take priority above physical access into the server room. So it's really important that we, as the board, and many times within an organization, as the leaders for risk, help create that balance around identification of risk. Once we've identified the risk, we need to go into the analyze and assess phase. The most elementary way to set it is we need to estimate. An estimate really is as vast, as how long is a string. Estimate the likelihood of it and the impact of risk. And then we have that quantitative over qualitative approach. Do we have a lot of risks, or do we only tackle the ones that is immediately possibly catastrophic? There's an absolute balance that plays when we look at that risk analysis. Then we look at our risk treatment plan. How do we approach these risks? Do we have a risk log? All of these kind of risk treatment plans needs to be logged in a way that it is treatable, measurable, and can be wrapped up in projects to help with that implementation plan. And then lastly, a bit that most organizations do rather poorly at is monitor and review. Risks change. When all of our employees were sent home, we had a very good handle on the risk within the office cybersecurity stack. When that workforce became a distributed remote workforce, The risks changed tremendously because most of them were connecting back to our information via self-provisioned internet lines. In some cases via self-provisioned equipment. So we immediately lost such a vast amount of controls that it became critical to come back to the drawing board and say, on monitor and review, this has now become the major risk for the organization, and it needs to be flagged all the way up to management. Because only with continuous monitoring can we really stay abreast of what is happening from a risk perspective. So when we look at these models, the monitor and control bit is the bit that really becomes very, very important post identification and analytics. So we should know what our risks are. We should analyze the likelihood of them happening, and I'm going to show you now quite pragmatically how that gets done. But then lastly, the monitor and control parts are so important to then going back and possibly identifying new risks. And I really like this image because it shows that circular motion of how risks play out and how risks evolve on a day-to-day point of view. Monitoring might show that your data privacy and data leakage risks has reduced tremendously because of new technology that was implemented. And that means the priority of that risk on re-identification can change drastically, and we can now put focus on the next big risk. So the monitor and control part of risks is probably the most important. I want us to do a little bit of a fun exercise. When we think of children in sport or young people in sport, this image might come up. What are the risks when it comes to soccer? You might fall, graze your arm a little bit. You might break an arm or a leg. But the important part is, what is the likelihood of that? Let's look at the next image. When your child comes to you, like my children have, and say, Mom, I want to do this sport. So I want to take a BMX bicycle and ride it down a tremendous ramp and then jump as high as I can and see if I can land it. What are the risks associated with that? Vastly different from soccer. Why? I'm going to tell us after the last image. The last image that comes up is skydiving. So now we assess 3 different sports. And clearly, by virtue of how I've stacked the images, they ramp up ever so slightly when it comes to the risk factor. But the important part of this is that everybody on the call now, and we can talk about it in the question section, but everybody on the call now have got a gut feel that this sort of ramps up, but we're not always certain what causes that gut feel. Now, when a risk, an IT risk, get placed on our desks, we 9 times out of 10 have a very good gut feel as to where this should rank. However, we sometimes get talked out of that specific risk analysis of us. So I want you to remember the next time you get posed with a risk to really trust your gut, and I'm going to tell you why right now. When you looked at those images, we weighed up 2 things. We weighed up the likelihood of an injury, and then we weighed up the criticality of an injury. Somebody falling on a soccer field, worst case scenario, will break an arm. Somebody falling off a bike at a devastating height will, best case scenario, break only an arm. somebody whose parachute doesn't open. We don't even endeavor to think of the results of an injury like that. What did we do with that? So when we look at the likelihood, how many people dive out of plane and doesn't seriously get injured? Hundreds. But when it does happen, it's catastrophic. Many people fall on a BMX and they get tremendous injuries. But there are also hundreds of participants that ride on a daily basis and don't really get injured. And then there are thousands of children around the world that play soccer and have never gained an injury in long careers on the soccer field. But intuitively, we can look at that and realize that the criticality versus the likelihood is really important from an assessment point of view. This risk assessment model, and there was an ask around the slides, everybody will get the slides again, is pretty much how we assess our risks. It's not unique to cybersecurity. It is a risk governance management assessment. But it plays really nicely into the example that I've just given. What are the probability on the soccer field of injury? And what are the severity? What are the probability on a skydive of injury, but what is the severity? And that really gives you an idea as to how our risks should get assessed. And sometimes this is really hard because we don't necessarily have the information on hand to really do it well. So I pivot back to this and say, identifying the risk, we intuitively have the skill to analyze and assess that risk almost on a gut feel. Within that, we then have the right to put a treatment plan in place for that risk. And lastly, we monitor that on an ongoing basis. So as I have mentioned, my children are of the middle category. They have decided that BMXing is one of the sports that they would like to participate in. And that rider that I showed in the first image is not nearly how a true BMX rider looks like when they are out on the track. This is what those youngsters look like. Why? Because the sport has identified the risk. The risk is falling. The likelihood of it, I'd say 50-50% on each of these races. What is the treatment plan? The treatment plan is that you will not see a BMX racer without long sleeve apparel. Why? Because a graze is the lightest of your injuries if you have a good fall. Most of them wear body armor, neck braces, and full face helmets and gloves, because we protect the parts that's going to hit the ground. And that is the treatment plan. Do we monitor it on an ongoing basis? Yes. I want to keep with this example because it really is an important thing and a way to remember it. Out of my two sons, both of them ride with body armor. They both ride with a liat brace, because I do feel out of that catastrophic nature of an injury, the one that I don't want is a broken neck. But my one son has suffered a tremendous injury to his left arm. So he cycles with an increased left arm brace, covering an old fracture, because his risk is different to my other son. So I want you to remember that in that treatment plan, to the same risk in two different departments, the treatment plan might be different. Let's have a look at how do we as an organization start looking at risk mitigation, and more specifically about the implementation. And I want to pause here, not because it is a framework that I subscribe, But because I want us to focus on how ISO 27001 sets out the obligations within our control for risk management. Organizational context, knowing whether I'm doing the risk assessment within one department or across the whole organization. Am I protecting information within one department or as it flows through the organization? Am I protecting the information as it passes to suppliers? What is my context? Then, have I properly defined the scope? What are the risks in which departments, underwritten by which technologies, that I would like to put within the scope of what I'm protecting? Leadership is so very important, and that's why I want to hover on this, not because I necessarily think this is the be all and end all of frameworks, standards, or guidelines when it comes to risk management. But I think it's very important to stress how frameworks put an emphasis on leadership. If the leadership has not bought in to becoming compliant with risks, or to mitigate risks, or to understand the treatment plans towards risks, the organization will follow suit. And then it goes into planning, support, operation, evaluation, and improvement. But the first three parts really sit within the ambit of what our role is as board members. When we look at how this would pan out, it really starts as step one by obtaining management support. Isn't that tremendous that before we kick off a project to ensure information system and management, we look at getting obtain the management support, creating a project, defining the scope, policies, and then it comes to defining the risk assessment methodology. And I want you to focus on how much defining and determining we have within our control, because that is the second point that I wanted to stress. Each organization is unique. Each organization is different from its peer, even within the same industry, because of cultural approaches, because of location, because of internal policies and procedures, because of strategy. And because of those nuances that are slightly different between each organization, there is no true standard for implementing risk management. There really is frameworks, guidelines, and standards that we should take internal to our organization and create our own. It is extremely important that we own our own framework towards risk management. I want to have a moment here in terms of pausing on the essential 8 from a security control perspective. And I think it ties so elegantly into the case study as well, because it breaks it up into specific risks that we need to look at. One of those risk planes or threat vectors is that prevention. The patch of application sits squarely within that. Then again, applying the Maersk facts, limit the extent of the attack. You heard the CIO say devastatingly that he woke up to chaos. How do I limit the extent of this risk? How do I stop it from spreading across my network? How do I stop that access, privileged access, from escalating and getting more access to more assets? And then that ability to recover is rather tremendous. They talked about their ability to recover quick, speedily, with great efficacy. And that should be commended, because also under the discussion point you mentioned, this was in 2017. It was pre a lot of the sensitivities that we now see within cybersecurity, pre a lot of the knowledge. Their ability to back up all of those lost devices were tremendous for the time. Now it should be par for the course. It absolutely should be par for the course. In my previous seminar, I talked about this balance. I talked about balance, and I want you as board members to remember that when I go into the checklist, and if I go into a little bit detail of risk mitigation and things as board members that we should really take to heart, because balance is the most important. We are the gatekeepers for the business in balance with the risk. There are people in more junior levels that will come with a risk with a disproportionate treatment plan. It is our obligation to say people cannot log in 7 times to do their job. It is a business deterrent. It is our jobs as leadership to apply sensibility and guidance to the management teams as to that balance between risk and business. Let's have a look at possible risks. None of these should be new to you. These risks within our organization, data breach is a massive risk to our organization, and it sits within multiple departments. As a board and as leadership, we have more risks than just technology processes. We have the people risk as well. Not only the people risk from a protection point of view, but from a skills gap point of view. If Maersk did not have the people to respond to that incident, they will not be where they are today. Ensuring that we have the skills gap addressed within our organization is an identifiable risk. We talk about cloud security, automation and integration, awareness. On my previous seminar, I spoke extensively about the importance of awareness within our organization. That can be a risk if it does not have a proper treatment plan and a project against it. Mobile devices have become the greatest risk of our organizations amongst COVID. The increased impact of state-sponsored cyber attacks. We saw that the Indian power grid was affected. We saw that there's been involvement of possible Ukrainian perpetrators in a lot of breaches within your territories. There are so many things to think about. And if you are an organization or you sit on the board of a non-profit organization or a state organization that holds critical information, state secrets, be known that you will be a target for state-sponsored cyber attacks. Risks related to IoT devices. I am currently sharpening my skills towards the 4th industrial revolution and writing a few articles around that. It is critical to understand what world we will live in the future based on all of the things connecting to the internet and the power that will hold. But the great responsibility that comes with it in securing it. AI, and I say the both sides of the barricade, the use of AI, the application of AI, being a product of AI output. Recently, we've seen that even within the recruiting spheres, it is said to be with online interviews, will move towards artificial intelligence engines interviewing the delegates. Within that lies a great risk when it comes to private information, private identifiable information. How do we address it in the onset of kicking off a project like that. Phishing threats, we've spoken about this. This is but to name a few of the risks that are of such high importance that we really need to ensure active oversight. Where's our thinking patterns going with this? How do we really break it down into addressable conversation starters for our leadership? And what do I mean with addressable conversation starters? As a board and responsible for the oversight of risk for organizations, and ultimately the last accountable person, how do we start the conversations with the executives and the leaderships, the managing executives of these organizations, to start asking the smart questions? So I've come up with a bit of a checklist. And it really is a conversation starter as to, do we understand all of our risks? Do we have a thorough handle on identifying the topmost critical and probable, and so they decrease in importance? Do we have a thorough understanding of the regulatory frameworks within each of our territories? We should. We've had regulatory frameworks within other disciplines. If any of the organizations that you sit with are listed on stock exchanges outside of your territory, you would be aware of frameworks and governance and regulatory things like Sarbanes-Oxley. In financial institutes, PCI DSS. These regulatory frameworks, these governance frameworks and standards are things that is not new to us as a board, but it is critical that we also understand what are the guidelines from a cybersecurity perspective when it comes to regulatory frameworks. Standards and guidelines, what do we subscribe to? What do we want to do? Do we want to use cybersecurity as a differentiator? Then we need to understand that we have a very high standard to hold. We need to have the ability to develop a risk management framework. And this is where that uniqueness comes in. Each organization with its unique attributes will have a unique approach to its risk management. And there is no fault in that. We don't have to follow the standards to the T. If you want to be able to pass an audit on a specific framework, yes, then you subscribe to that framework to the letter of the word. But if your organization has got a good handle on its own combined framework and audit practices, that should suffice when it comes to developing and managing a risk framework. Developing a risk culture, I've spoken about this lightly. If we are last on the agenda every time, we are last of mind. And it's very important that we set the example for our organization to ensure that they take risk serious. And then it comes to the implementation parts, the enterprise risk management strategy. Have we defined it? And do we know where we want to go? The enterprise risk management implementation plan would be an output out of the strategy. What are the first projects that we'll kick off to manage our most critical risks? And then ultimately, accountability is key. If we don't have a dedicated risk officer and audit framework, we will not be successful. There's an old saying that says, people don't do what we expect, they do what we inspect. And that's rather sad about humanity, but it's absolutely the truth. If there is a dedicated person that is responsible for managing the ERM, that is responsible for the strategy, that is gold. It came out of the commentary from the case study, and I think the case study was so powerful, Prof. if there is a person goaled and incentivized towards that, kept honest by a complementary audit framework, that is when our organization steps up to the next level of maturity. That is when our organization reviews and improves their practices, monitors and controls their risks, have risk logs and risk log treatment plans for each of their identified risks. That is when our organization have a handle on how do we approach our risk. When it comes to implementation, some of us want to take our hands in our hair and go, really, where do I start? Where do I start giving my organization guidance as to implementing some of this, what you've just said, Corien? I think it's rather simplistic. We need to start with a plan that is practical. And again, it talks to the ownership of business versus risk. We need to have a risk acceptance model. In some cases, you need to accept the risk. If you give the keys to your car to your 17-year-old, you need to, once you let go of that set of keys, accept the risk of him driving your car. And if that risk is within acceptable parameters, then you need to let go of the key. And then we certainly need to look at this ongoing review process. If we unpack that in slight more detail, and I'm conscious of the time because I want to wrap up and leave some time for questions, our practical plan needs to be attainable. If the organization comes to us with a plan that's going to make us 100% compliant with everything within 3 months, it is unattainable. The business will be weighed down by that, and it is impractical. We need to have that balance with business. We need to have it clearly scoped, and we need to have it measurable. If we can't measure what we're putting out as the practical plan, we can't be successful jointly. When we look at the risk acceptance model, agreeable risk acceptance, do we pass the key or do we leave the key? Did he practice his driving or do we not allow him to drive by himself? We need to set as a business, what is that acceptable risk? And what are we agreeable with? Set the perimeters of that, because the same risk in 2 different business departments might be different. And then where we can, take out risk insurance. Make sure that we cover ourselves for that can financially ruin us. Incident response is a great example. It is a policy that somebody with the skills and the knowledge and the tools are going to step in the door the day that you get hacked. That is the type of policy that you need to ensure that you have in absence of skills internal to your organization to do that forensic analysis, air gapping the network, doing all of those, because there are people out there that do that on a daily basis, that's got the fitness to run these war room scenarios on behalf of your business and respond in an adequate manner. And you can have them on the red telephone if you have incident response. Ongoing review, measure, monitor risk. I can't stress that enough. I've stressed that enough today. Review business changes and threat vectors. Constantly review, and finally, drive a culture of improvement. How do we improve our attitude towards risk? How do we improve the risk treatment plans for the next review cycle? Better document it, better train all our staff around it. There will be always risks in breaching the gap to implementation. We talk about the risk in the risk. What are those? Risk consistency or consistently. Talks about that different risks within different departments not weighing up the same. We talk about the qualitative versus quantitative. Do we ensure that all of our risks, or are we have got treatment plans, or are we at a place where we can say this risk is acceptable to the business? We identify it as a risk, but the probability is low, and we think we've done enough to educate our people with regards to this. So we are now at a place where we accept it.
Okay. We just wanted to thank you to sort of set the stage very well. And I thought I'll just get some context, and wonderful presentation by Corien, but I thought I'll just summarize what we see from an Indian context point of view. Okay, so let me summarize this. We did a study of what we saw from the Indian market, and when we looked at what are the popular attack vectors in the Indian scenario, and we mapped painstakingly in the last 6 months, and we looked at 4 important critical vectors, and that would kind of go with the model what Corien talked about in terms of mitigating the risk. The first and foremost large vector is actually email and smishing. That's the first vector if you want to really act as a practitioner to block it and add more technical capabilities around that. So email and smishing contributes close to about 70% of attack proliferation. That's the first vector. The second, what we saw was identity theft, whereby your identity is stolen in a GitHub, in your cloud platform, and hackers actually use those credentials and then to come inside your setup, and then sort of got into your data center. So the second big vector, what we saw was, how do you have your strong identity measures implemented? And the world is moving towards a passwordless scenario, and world is moving towards geofencing, whereby your identity is something which you got to protect. And the very popular attack, what we've seen from Maze, which happened in the Indian setup, actually the credential theft happened in the cloud, and we call it as cloud jacking. So identity is something which you need to protect and put a stronger multi-factor authentication capability. That's a second single vector what you need to plug in. And the third vector was, during the pandemic, because of the downtime, they didn't want to sort of invest heavily on on-premise. More and more cloud adoption actually took place. And we are seeing more and more CISOs, practitioners coming back and then saying, what I used to have as visibility in on-premise, can I get that in the cloud piece? So more and more tools are being sort of deployed to enhance your cloud visibility. And the fourth important vector, which we saw, was endpoint. The race for endpoint protection was the biggest one during the pandemic, because what it used to be working inside your setup, right now it's turned out to be your first line of defense, because working from home. So to mitigate your risk, if you start looking at your email, start looking at your identity, start looking at your cloud visibility, start looking at your so-called endpoint protection. So these 4 vectors constitute the majority of the attacks what we've seen in the Indian market, right? And that is something as a takeaway, be from a technology point of view, from a tools point of view, more you secure and mitigate your risk on these 4 vectors, you're better off from your risk posture point of view. The other part, what I wanted to actually sort of share it across is, it's just not work from home, which is getting a lot of hype. The issue about training, the cyber training, how do you make sure you create a simulation environment in terms of your top executives going through your cyber drills and going through a certification process in terms of attending those minimum criteria. More than the technology investments on working from home, but equal investments about your people. That is something which we're seeing. And the other single investments, what we're seeing from the customers, is investment on incident response. How do you rewrite your incidents? How do you make sure your playbook for incident response is completely rewritten during pandemic, right? And enhancing your SOC, that is something which we heard from customers time and time and again. Your security operations, which used to be working inside your perimeter, when everything was not work from home, how do you transform and rewrite your process, right? And that's becoming an important practitioner's approach. The last piece, which we are hearing from customers time and time and again, is gone are the days people are looking at a point product approach, where I had a point problem, I bought a point product. But today, because of console hopping, because of alert fatigue, what we are seeing is a shift from a point product approach to a platform-based approach. And a platform covers your endpoint, your cloud, your network, and your mobility devices, and even your identity. So if I have to sum it up and then give as a practitioner's advice in three sentences, look for your 4 important key vectors which we spoke: email, endpoint, cloud, identity. Number 2, look at beyond technical tools on incident response, security operations center, enhancement, and training. And the third, shift away from point products, but look at a platform-based approach, which will give you a single dashboard, which will enhance you from an automation point of view, and it will give you the threat intelligence, what you need from a global point of view, to come and look at your indicators of compromise, what's actually happening at the bottom. So if you take away these 3 key messaging, and I think we'll mitigate the risk far better, and India will continue to work tirelessly. We've enabled close to about 500,000 endpoints during the pandemic as a part of a program, and we are more than happy to face the second wave if it comes through as well. So back to you, Professor, and thank you for organizing this at a strategic level. And CISCO is very excited to partner with you, and we've been on this journey for a long time. We'll be more than happy to contribute moving forward. Thank you. Back to you, Prof.
Thank you. Thank you so very much, Mr. Vishak Raman. Thank you, Ms. Corien. Thank you, everybody, for being part of this wonderful journey.